Yon Namina, welcome back. So today I'm trying out my new audio on my phone. Hopefully this sounds a little better than my USB earbuds. This is actually my third time trying to record it, but on my second time, which was my more successful one, it sounded absolutely awful. So here I am redoing it with just my iPhone recording. So once again, this is my traveling to Japan series where I talk about my past experience, or my first experience with traveling to Japan. Last time I talked about the wait that it took for me to finally get into Japan, or the build-up for me to book the trip to begin with. Today, however, I will discuss my experience from booking the flight all the way to the day before the departure. Now, this one's going to be a little more informative rather than personal. So the first part of this video has 6 sections relating to travel. The first section is goals. The second section is booking a flight. The third section is points of interest. The fourth section is transportation. The fifth section is hotels. And the last section is luggage. There's a second part to this video as well that is going to be more about my subjective or personal experience, or the emotional ride I had to deal with from booking the flight to before the departure day. And it should go without saying that these pieces of advice will be more applicable to Japan, but I'm sure you may see some crossover with other countries. Just make sure to reapply the logic into how that country functions. So the first section to talk about is the goals. And I knew what I wanted to do was I wanted to go to Tokyo, I wanted to go to Shimoda, and I wanted to go to the surrounding prefectures. More specifically, if you couldn't tell already by my avatar, I'm a huge Pokemon Fire Red fan. So I was kind of curious to see how the entire Pokemon region based itself off the inspired sources. I've done my research before. Here's a quick link on a wiki that I found a while ago that roughly says what each location is based off in the real life Japan. I have a few disagreements with it, but I think it's decent. I just kind of implemented my own interpretation of it as well. So when you travel to Japan, at least, you want to know where you want to go. If most people will usually want to go the Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto trip, but there's still, even depending on the length of your trip, my trip ended up being about a little over 5 weeks, so I had a little more to plan. And I didn't mention in this video, but I had to plan this in the span of about 3 weeks, which was pretty stressful. Don't do that. Try to give yourself at least a 4-month buffer. And I should note that I was booking this during fall, which will come up a little more later. So yes, know where roughly you want to be at when you go to Japan. And I think you want to do some extra research if you want to go to Tokyo and Osaka, because they are bigger prefectures. And this kind of applies to any wide prefecture. If you want to go to Hokkaido, make sure to look up specific areas and cities, not just the entire region. Even though Hokkaido is kind of more rural, so maybe you might get away with that, but still, you want to make sure you do. Even in the section where it's broad strokes, you want to at least have a rough idea of what will come next. For me, Shimoda is pretty specific. In Shizuoka, I knew I wanted to go there because it's a place I'd done research on before, and it's one I had to go to. So the next section is booking a flight. Now, I didn't quite know this when I was actually booking it, but I actually got one of the better airlines. So the two airlines, if you live in the United States at least, the two airlines that I think are pretty reliable are Singapore Airlines and Japan Airlines. I've heard this from other Japanese people that these are the two most reliable airlines to use. And I think I'd agree. I think I ended up going with Singapore Airlines. I think it's a very good company. I think it's a pretty good airline. Although one big tip that I found out this time around, rather than as opposed to the other time, was look at the airline's official website, and you're probably going to find things for cheaper and extra offers that wouldn't other exist in something like, let's say, Expedia or Booking. So one big tip I definitely want to give is jet lag, or how to deal with jet lag. So I told myself that I didn't really care if I received jet lag when I landed back, but I knew I didn't want to get jet lag when I arrived on my trip. This is why I wanted to make sure that my flight landed around 6 to 8 p.m. in Japan. That way, when you arrive, it's still early enough where a lot of public transportation systems still work, and a lot of hotels are still kind of up and running. Like the city is still alive essentially, or the country's still alive, but it's not early enough where you have to deal with a lot of the traffic as well as the coming jet lag. Because chances are around 6 p.m., it's probably going to take you about 2 to 4 hours, maybe even a little longer, for you to finally be set in your hotel. And once that time comes, it's already going to be night, so you're going to fall asleep, and it's going to be a fresh new day like it's nothing. So I highly recommend arriving at a place during the late afternoon. The third section is looking for points of interest, and this kind of relates back to the first section. So say you want to go to Tokyo, and say you really wanted to go to, say, Shibuya. Now what you want to do is you want to find specific areas to go to. And there are standard tourist traps you can do, such as the Shibuya Pokemon Center, or the Shibuya Station in general is quite a sight to see. Or just in other towns, you can go to Akihabara or Tokyo Tower, like just the very standard stuff. However, I think what people forget is that you need to eat. And when you're in a foreign country, there's no better opportunity to try newer food. So what I ended up doing is, before I headed to my trip to Japan, I went onto Yelp and wanted to look at highly rated restaurants around each of the areas I relatively wanted to go to. I tried to plan out about 3 a day. So I made sure I had a list of restaurants that I knew I was kind of ready to try out in case I needed something to kind of fall back on. This is somewhat of a slight tangent. I think it's better to be over-prepared and not follow a schedule, rather than being under-prepared and then realizing you need a schedule. So even if it might be stressful during the time, I say plan things out just to fall back on just in case, even if you don't end up following it up anyways. Which honestly, I only followed up with maybe around 50% of my plans anyways, so. But anyways, back to what I was saying. So now that you have these 3 restaurants, you kind of know where you're going to be moving and where you're going to be going. And this may be a little more challenging if you plan on being in the same place for a long time. I was a little more mobile in my Japan trip. The way I broke off my trip was the first third was going to be in Tokyo. The second third was going to be in the surrounding prefectures of Tokyo, plus a few more north. And then my last third was going to be back at Tokyo. So because I was so much on the move, I always kind of had something new to try out. But I still wanted kind of like a comforter blanket of, I need to come back to somewhere I'm kind of a little familiar with. This is especially true since this was my first time going into Japan. I wanted to make sure that I got associated with the main city, and then leaving Japan would be an easier process if I ended up staying at the same place I was. All right, I'm getting on too many tangents. All right, now the fourth section is seeing the flow of transportation and knowing how to get from point of interest to point of interest. Now that you kind of know where your airport, your points of interest, and which areas you want to go to, this is where you want to specifically look into the public transportation for Japan. Now there's stuff like railways, buses, and the Shinkansen in general, and obviously Uber and stuff like that, which I actually didn't end up trying Uber at all. So what you want to do is you want to go to Google Maps, look up something like, let's say, the Narita airport, type it in as an address, and then go to the point of interest, look for directions, and then look at the public transportation options. There it will give you a rough estimate of the time and price. Obviously, this will vary depending on when you're going and the availability of the trolleys themselves or the railways. But this is also like a good way to kind of get an estimate on price for your transportation and what you kind of expect on taking. Now, don't overestimate your walking ability. 20 minutes may sound like a short time, but for someone like me who ended up staying there for 5 weeks, was walking basically everywhere, and most of the activities I did were walking based. And considering you also have to come back and maybe carry around luggages, you want to minimize your public transportation, or you want to minimize your walking as much as possible. And this is especially true with the next sections with hotels, but I'm going to get into that later. Now, something I also want to bring up is special passes. If you're a tourist, chances are the JR Rail Pass is something that's been on your radar. And I wouldn't really recommend that pass unless you plan on doing the very generic Tokyo to Kyoto to Osaka trip, like the very standard trip that you always see. If you want that cookie cutter trip, I say go for that. Or if you just want something if you have plenty of money and you just want something stress-free, then go for that pass, I suppose. But there's actually other sub-passes that people don't really know about. So you can get a pass for like specific areas like the Northern Niigata section, and I'll have a link in description for that as well. So these will usually have a smaller window of usage, but will also be significantly cheaper, and will also have the same benefits of a regular JRL pass. Some may be applicable and may change over time, so just make sure to check the description of these passes. But if you plan on using something like the Shinkansen quite frequently, then I highly recommend getting the ordinary JRL pass. Especially if your trip is exactly like 7 days or 14 days, like the JRL pass stated, do that. But as someone like me who wanted to go more into the back areas of Japan, I really only bought one special pass just once, and that's really all I needed. And I only used it for like 5 days, maybe. So optimize your trip as far as expenses go, I recommend. So the fifth section, which kind of brings it all together, is now book into your hotel. Now that you know your goals, or like which areas you're going to be in, now that you know where you're going to be landing, now you know your points of interest, now you know how transportation works, try to book a hotel that brings that all together and makes it so much easier. Now, I should go without saying that if you have a specific hotel in mind that you want to go to, just get that one. Don't even listen to what I'm saying at that point. But if you want to fill in some gaps, then here's maybe my own recommendations. Now, I personally did not want to share a room, so I avoided stuff like dormitories. That's something that wasn't for me, yet something in other websites, they might offer that and might advertise it as a hotel until you look at the description and you realize it's shared dormitory. Watch out for those. And the same could apply for stuff like public baths. I knew I wasn't going to be comfortable with a public bath, so I tried to avoid those, and I only tried to get hotels that had a shower for one, and that's it. Now for me, I had a really good friend that owed me a favor and wanted to repay that favor by booking my first hotel for me and the first third of my trip, and that was very helpful. And that kind of helped me get a little more acquainted with the hotel experience in Japan. Now that hotel was in Shinjuku, which was nice because it was specifically in an area where a lot of the public transportation was surrounded by. I think a really good hotel would either be right next to a station or be near like 3 of them. I think that's a very good hotel to be at, especially in Tokyo. If you're more out in an outside region, then I think just being next to a station is good enough. I'll have a few more personal experience that I'll talk about with booking hotels later on very specific hotels, but that's going to be more in the future. And the last section, to the more informative part, is deciding what to bring in your luggages. So I only had access to 2 luggages, a carry-on and a bag, but yet my trip was 5 weeks. I knew I was going to have to wash at least once, so I made sure to also book a hotel that I knew it would be easy for me to wash my clothes. I also brought a toolkit just in case, like screwdrivers and stuff, just to make sure I had everything I needed. But just bring your standard hygiene stuff. Honestly, that's the only advice I could really give. And since I was going in November to early December, I also made sure to load up on warm clothes, and that should be a given. However, you don't want to overfill when going, because you never know if you might come back with more. So I highly recommend you being as light as possible when going to Japan. Now, carrying luggages should generally be easy if you're doing Uber stuff, but be mindful of public transportation stuff. You are kind of filling in some like places if you carry your luggages around. If you're like in one of the trains, and it's one of those crowded ones, you're gonna look really rude if you carry your luggages with you, especially if they're much bigger and you have many of them. I think it's kind of okay, in my opinion at least, if you know the train is kind of empty. There's a couple places in Japan that I knew it wasn't going to be crowded anyways because I was going in at very late times, so I wasn't really worried about crowding the train or anything when I took in my luggages there. Otherwise, don't go to the middle of Shibuya with like 5 luggages. Don't do that. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. I'm going to have a picture of it up here and maybe a link in the description, but there's also a service in Japan that will move the luggages for you from hotel to hotel. But this system is an okay way, at least a decent way, to try to get your heavy luggage from place to place if you plan on doing something a little more narrow. And once again, I'll go into more detail when that day comes up. So if you guys have any specific informative questions on what to do when traveling to Japan, feel free to comment and I'll try to reply as soon as possible. Now for the last part of my video that I wanted to do, which was my personal experience planning all this out, because everything that I just blurted out to you was being planned in about a 3-week time period. And once again, I'm a first-time traveler. There was a lot of stress and depression going on during that time period. I honestly felt like I was kind of losing my mind. I remember very negative thoughts started to cloud me. I started to think, what if I don't end up liking Japan? What if all this excitement was for nothing? What if I have an awful time there? Or, just very negative feelings that shouldn't be associated with a trip, because trips are kind of meant to be, you want to have a good time if you're spending that much money. What if I'm hated? What if I do a mistake? Again, just very negative emotions that were going on during that period. Just ifs, and that's what I kept doing. But despite all that negative emotion, I remember on the last day, the day before the departure, I zipped up my final luggage bag, looked back at everything, and then all that negativity just faded away. There was a huge sigh of relief. When I let out that huge sigh of relief, I kind of realized that humans are at the whim of their own stress. It doesn't matter what the external factors are, but your mental health matters a lot more than you think it does. So if the informative section wasn't enough for you, one piece of advice that I would like to give is just make sure to breathe. Alright, and that's going to do it for this video. Sorry it was a little bit jumbled. Once again, I'm still on my training arc for video recording. I hope to get better as the days goes on, and as this video series continues in general. So the next video is going to be my personal experience with the departure day all the way to the arrival day. Alright, till next time. Mata ne.